Welcome to Round Hill Radio, the podcast from Round Hill Community Church. Through our conversations, we discover the holy and the ordinary, find moments of grace and peace, and redefine what we're talking about when we talk about faith. Welcome to Round Hill Radio. I'm Leslie.
I'm Ed.
Well, good morning, Ed, on this exciting snow day.
Wow, this is quite the snowstorm. Just when I thought winter was over for sure.
It's not, apparently it's not over. But the teacher part of me is thrilled.
I'll bet.
To be here today. We're actually recording a little later because we had the time. So,
well, I had these meetings and Zoom meetings scheduled for today. The first thing I thought was, oh gosh, I can't cancel any of those meetings. They're just happening online anyways.
I know, that's the thing. We have to sort of almost be more intentional to really take the snow day.
Make it a virtual snow day.
I think so. Well, right? And they've been talking about tomorrow. We'll see. This podcast will probably come out tomorrow, so our audience will know. But they've been talking about tomorrow, if there's a snow day, doing like a half day virtual at school, which I think is a nice compromise because it's like get a little education, but go play in the snow and be a kid and enjoy what you would otherwise be able to enjoy. So I appreciate that.
Yeah,
the school's
that sounds
doing
good.
That. So we're continuing our conversation about grace today. Yes. And the idea of like, what is it actually? Which is a question that comes up fairly often, you were saying.
I know, it's a word we hear a lot. I still think it's part of our language, not as much as it used to be, but people talk about grace and mercy, people's names. I know a lot of people who are named Grace. It's a lovely name. And, but I have had people in the congregation, in all my congregations over the years, say, what is that thing? And so maybe this will be the podcast when we can help those people out and maybe get a little clarity for ourselves. So I was thinking about this because when you and Dan and I met back in, November and December to think about our sermon, our worship themes for January and February, we wanted to create a whole series of worship services based on this notion of grace and to sort of weave that like a thread. So kind of subtle, but sometimes a little more explicit. So to start off with today, Leslie, I just thought it might be helpful to lift up two different passages that have been, I think, very helpful for me over the years as I've thought about grace. And one of them comes from the Gospel of John. So we have these four artistic portraits of Jesus in the Bible. We know them as the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And John was probably written last of the four, but he has this single verse in the very first chapter where he's describing this person who's coming into the world, who's so full of light. And he describes Jesus as someone who was full of grace and truth. Mm. I love the fact that John pairs those words, grace and truth. They make me think sometimes that I have known people who were gracious, but maybe not truthful, and truthful who weren't necessarily gracious. So, to put the two together is the whole thing. It's sort of the vision of what all of us have it in us to become. People who are gracious, kind, who do unexpectedly good things for other people, but we're also truth tellers. And when we see things about our lives or our world that we think should be named, that we're prepared to do that as well. So that links with my second short scripture passage, which is from the letter to the Ephesians. And this comes from the 4th chapter. It's the 15th verse. And the writer of this little letter says, "But speaking the truth in love," that's the phrase that I really want to highlight, "we must grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ." So I think this person is saying, again, Jesus is the vision of what we have it in us to become, someone who's full of grace and truth. And I love that from a very practical standpoint. I love that phrase, speak the truth in love, because let's face it, in our relationships and in our work, there always comes a time when you have to say the tough thing, and to be able to say it with love, in love, that's a really helpful way to get the conversation started. So I'm just going to stop there for a moment, hit the pause button, and say that's my entry into the world of grace, right? That so it's a given for Jesus that he is full of grace and truth, and the expectation is that we're also to be full of grace and truth. And so let's create a pause there and see how we're doing so far.
I think it's so interesting because to me, it feels like grace is such a multifaceted word that there's so many, like you say, entry points to it. And yeah, speaking the truth in love is such an interesting idea that really connects with me. I'm one of those people that I aim to really care about how I say things.
Right.
If I'm going to say a piece of hopefully constructive criticism or a suggestion, or just flat out say something isn't going right, to say it in a way that at least is not a judgment-filled thing.
Yes.
And I don't always succeed. You can ask the people in my world. I try. I don't succeed all the time. But that idea, I think, really connects with me, because I know there's some people who just, and it might be a cultural thing. I'm from the South, and sometimes you have almost you go so far in the other direction, and people try to speak with grace, and sometimes you lose the truth.
Right. Yeah, there was a hard thing in there that you were trying to say that just kind of got lost in the soft.
Right. You're like,
right?
What?
Yeah.
What? Well, bless your heart too. Okay. I don't know what's happening. Right. It's such an interesting idea. It's funny. You made me, when we were starting this episode, it made me think back to, and I had forgotten this memory, that when I was working at the church in Westport, Connecticut, where I worked during graduate school, we did a series on grace. And I think it was either the first Sunday or the last Sunday. So I was using Mark Miller, one of our favorite composers. He has a setting of Amazing Grace with a different tune. It's got a lot of energy. It's really fun. And that Sunday was the day that my friend Heather gave birth to her daughter, who she named Grace. Oh. And she'd been on bed rest, and she had no idea the sermon series. She had no idea the anthem. Oh. And it was just one of those really cool God moments where you're like, everything's aligned today.
Yes.
Which I think is so fun.
That's a beautiful description of grace. I think you described it as one of those, it's a God moment. And I think we get the sense when we have a grace moment like that, this is not anything we could have created. Mm-hmm. It came together, right? And I do think that people feel that grace is sometimes an almost physical power that they can feel in their lives that made something happen that they couldn't have made happen by themselves or for themselves. So I think that this word grace, as you say, it has so much nuance to it. But I guess if somebody were really pressing me to maybe not define it, but to describe it a little bit, I would say that at its core, it's kind of unexpected, maybe even a sense of undeserved goodness. Mm-hmm. It's not that we did anything to get it or could have done anything. It's the way that life comes back to us. And I'm good. I'll give an example of this that had a huge impact on my life, especially in terms of my economic well-being at one point in my life. I was a student in seminary and had very, very few resources economically. In fact, I had a beat-up car, a Volkswagen Dasher. And I remember that talk about grace, my mother had sent me a check to kind of help out, and it was for $100. And the battery went dead in the car. Oh. And by the time it was towed and the battery was replaced and I got it back, that bill was like $99. So that was the end of that.
No, that went fast.
That went really fast. And then some months later, I had a call out of the blue from my pastor at my home church in Bennington, Vermont. And he asked me if I was sitting down. And I said, no, but I can. He said, well, I think you want to be sitting down for this news. Somebody, and I never discovered the identity of the person, offered to pay for my last year in seminary.
Oh my gosh.
Completely out of the blue. As I said, never found the identity of the person. I said to my pastor, how do I even begin to thank this individual for this? And so I wrote these To Whom It May Concern letters for about a year, sort of giving this person updates about what a difference this gift had made in my life.
Wow.
And that was a very dramatic moment, but it was something that I could never have imagined or expected at the time. And I say not even imagined, because the skies felt kind of low most days, right?
Yeah.
As they can when you're really kind of scrapping for, from week to week.
Yeah.
And I think that this is just such an important quality of grace. It's the flowing of something towards us. And once it touches our lives, suddenly, everything looks a little better and more beautiful and lighter. And the other side of it, I would say, Leslie, is that it's then something that seems to want to express itself then through us. So as we've been touched in that way, then we also want to reach out and touch others. And I guess one last quick story. Have you heard of these sort of pay it forward stories that happen sometimes, where someone goes through a drive-through and says, right, I'll pay for the next person. And there was an incredible example of this recently, and I can't remember where it was in the United States, but I think it was at a Dairy Queen. And there was something like 60 cars in a row paid for, the car behind it, or however that worked.
Wow.
And it was just remarkable. And so those to me are experiences of grace, which we then associate that's how God likes to operate, kind of unexpectedly and in just beautifully surprising ways.
Definitely. I think we have that experience so much in music making.
Say more.
I think particularly of jazz music, of improvisation, where there's that spark of creativity, especially if you're improvising in a group. It's very much, you have like agreed upon certain things,
right?
And then you go, and then there's a grace and generosity of accepting where that one person is taking you musically, and you're like, okay, I guess we're going over here now. And there's also that grace and generosity and spark of just when something magical happens, and you don't know necessarily where it came from, but it just happens and appears. And then on sort of a more perhaps simple level, I think we have these moments all the time, especially at choir, where someone will do something and it might have been I'm using air quotes here, a mistake.
Yeah.
And it sparks an idea either in me or in someone else. And it's just so exciting in those moments. I think of one time we were having a conversation because we were doing Blessed Be the Tie That Binds as introit.
Yes.
And I think Anna is a benediction, but the text for the benediction for the second verse is really quite dark. I think, if I'm doing this off of memory, but it's like, when we're called to part, it gives us inward pain. And it's like, it's very melodramatic and not quite the kind of like, we're leaving, we love each other, let's go. And so I think I had scheduled it and not taken. I hadn't had my hymnal next to me at the moment, which I've learned that lesson. And so we got to choir, and I opened and I went, oh no, this is not going to work.
There's
and
a surprise.
And the choir decided, well, I can't remember whose idea it was, but we decided to rewrite we wrote our own text for
beautiful.
it. So we have the Roundhill second verse of Blessed Be the Tie That Binds. I don't think I have it in this hymnal.
Wow.
But it's lovely.
Tradition evolving.
Wasn't that cool? And so we all came together. We all, and I think it's better than the original second verse. I'm biased. It's very subjective, but I'm just so proud of them and just that's just very much the attitude I think you have to have when you come into a creative space collaboratively, is like, well, that doesn't quite work, but let's figure out something and do it together, and kind of that space and generosity of just goodwill and like, we're going to make it work because we're in it together. That stuff happens kind of all the time in really subtle ways. In music too. Like, you can think about, I've been obviously collaborating with our soloists one-on-one for like a year now.
Months. Yep.
Months. And, there's times where I'll misread something or they'll not see something and you just roll with it, right? You're like, oh, I guess we're skipping that beat. And you just kind of keep going. And, oh, well, that wasn't the original word, but the choir isn't singing it and the congregation isn't singing it. Did it fundamentally change the meaning? No, then we shall keep going, Right. And this idea that, it's, we have each other and we give each other that grace to be perfectly imperfect.
Yes.
Because we're all trying our best here in the really global pandemic.
Right. Under unusual circumstances.
Yeah, for sure. And even under normal circumstances, I think we can take each ourselves, especially as musicians, take ourselves really seriously, and striving for quality can sometimes, it's like it's letting the idea of perfect get in the way of good or great.
Yes.
And I aim for great. And I know that perfect is not really, I don't think it's worth sacrificing what you need to sacrifice to get to perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sort of where I've landed.
Great can be pretty darn good.
Yes. Yeah. Right. And some days that's fine too.
Yeah. Well, in your comments, Leslie, there is so much nuance about grace that it can come from, a mistake or something that we might initially perceive as a failure. It can be a community event where people suddenly rally around something that needs to happen. It can be a creative event. But I guess in all of this, there's the notion that we're letting ourselves be vulnerable enough to let this inner creative power kind of have its way with us. And I've become really fond of this phrase, let's follow the Spirit wherever it may lead. Mm. And I get the sense that this was, I look back at the stories that we have about Jesus, that this seems to be kind of what he was doing with his life, right? He moved from village to village, and there was a kind of a haphazard quality about it. And I really like this. I think it's much more to do with improvisation, and it's good to plan, because sometimes it's because we've planned that we can then deviate from the plan, but we have something to start with, right? I mean, I think that's the point. And I was mentioning to you that I've really been enjoying this book by a man named Mark Riddell. He's in New Zealand, an author from New Zealand. He's written a beautiful little book called Sacred Journey. And he describes a time in his life when he was hitchhiking. And this was in days of yore when hitchhiking was something that people did safely. And he just got to a point in the journey where it seemed like nobody wanted to pick him up. So he just sat down. He was in a rural area, just sat down, pulled out his guitar, which he had with him, and started playing along. And pretty soon, this tractor comes along with a Maori farmer. And this gentleman pulls up, stops his tractor, produces a paper bag. And I'm quoting Mark Riddell now. He says, this man said, well, the missus and I saw you from the farmhouse. And, you looked a little lonely out here, so we prepared some breakfast for you. Oh. So this beautiful gift of food, right, come from nowhere. And then he said, one of my friends, he's another farmer. He's going to be coming along here in about a half an hour, and with his car, he'll take you the next part of your journey. And Mark said that he remembered that his entire life. And it made him want to reach out to others in the same way. And I am just struck by the stories that people tell if we give one another the space to tell stories of grace about these moments in our lives. And they sometimes are just moments, just fleeting moments that have this really great staying power, and we keep going back to them and talking about them. And I think that this is another quality of grace. It's not like it has to happen all the time. Although maybe every breath, right, is a kind of moment of grace. But these special moments, they really carry us for a long way.
I think you're absolutely right. So thank you so much for chatting with me about grace today. I think we could do a year of grace. There's
sure
so
could.
Much to talk about.
Keep it going.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have a closing thought for the day for us today?
I have a line that I love very much from one of Toni Morrison's novels called Beloved. And one of the characters in the book is talking to a group of people who are really downtrodden. And she says that the only grace you can have is the grace that you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always thought about that, because it's that we can also, moments of grace can come unexpectedly, maybe in unimaginable ways, but also we can also imagine wonderful moments of grace that can come our way, and good things. And I think especially we need to do that during the pandemic, and especially on a day when we're getting like 20 inches of snow. So let's imagine gracious days ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you, Leslie. Blessings to all.
Thanks for listening. Round Hill Radio is brought to you by the friends and members of Round Hill Community Church. For more information, please visit roundhillcommunitychurch.org.